For a tense half-minute, the world stood stunned, unable to grasp what had just unfolded. Across central Thran, the high-pitched wails of sirens echoed, cutting through the morning air as dark plumes of smoke spiraled upward into the sky. Emergency vehicles surged through the streets surrounding a heavily fortified government compound, while security forces moved swiftly to seal entire neighborhoods across the capital. Eyewitnesses recounted a sudden volley of explosions detonating almost simultaneously, their shockwaves shattering windows throughout nearby buildings. Traffic ground to a halt as onlookers lifted their gaze toward the rising smoke, struggling to discern whether they were witnessing a tragic accident, a targeted assault, or the harbinger of something far more consequential. Within mere minutes, rumors raced through the city faster than any official communication could keep pace. Initial unverified accounts began filtering out through encrypted channels and foreign newsrooms alike. It was reported that Iran's highest-ranking leadership had been convening within the compound at the time. Some whispers suggested the supreme leader himself was present. Others indicated that several senior officials had abruptly gone dark, unreachable by any means. Financial markets responded almost immediately. Oil prices surged sharply. Regional air defense systems quietly escalated their alert statuses. Diplomatic lines buzzed with urgent calls across time zones, with every conversation circling back to the same urgent question. What exactly just happened in Thran? For over 30 years, the Islamic Republic had orbited around the authority of a single individual. His sanction determined foreign policy, military decisions, and the delicate internal power struggles shaping the nation's direction. Now, amid clouds of smoke and blaring alarms, the unthinkable possibility emerged that this pivotal figure had vanished abruptly from the center of power, and all of it unfolded in no more than 30 seconds. The shock waves of that moment rippled outward, but the story of these critical 30 seconds was rooted deep in the past, long before the explosions echoed through the capital. To grasp how the most powerful man in Iran could be so swiftly eliminated right at home, we must rewind to the system that protected him, a system forged in the crucible of 1979. It was then that the political apparatus consolidating one man's dominance over Iran was born. Before that year, the country had been ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, an authoritarian monarch whose regime maintained close strategic ties to the United States. From Washington's perspective, Iran was a pivotal ally in the Cold War, a reliable bastion amid a region of shifting allegiances. Yet inside Iran, discontent simmered and swelled. Accelerated modernization disrupted deep-rooted social traditions, while political repression muted voices of dissent. Secret police shadowed opposition figures, protests were harshly crushed, and wealth concentrated increasingly among elites entwined with the monarchy's inner circle. What looked stable on the international stage felt brittle and precarious domestically. By the late 1970s, unrest rippled through major cities. Religious leaders, students, workers, and intellectuals, often divided by ideology, found common cause united in their opposition to the Shah's regime. The protests kept growing, drawing bigger and bigger crowds each time. With every government crackdown, public anger surged even further. A powerful momentum was building, heading toward an irreversible change. At the heart of this upheaval was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had spent years in exile, openly criticizing the monarchy. When the Shah finally fled the country, Khomeini returned to Tehran to massive, enthusiastic crowds. Within just a few months, the old monarchy crumbled, replaced by the Islamic Republic, founded on an entirely new principle of authority. Under this new constitution, supreme power no longer lay with elected officials, but with the supreme leader, a religious figure tasked with safeguarding the revolution and guiding the state. This dramatic transformation redefined Iran's role on the global stage. The United States, once seen as an ally, became an adversary. Israel, regarded by Iran's new leadership as a symbol of Western influence in the region, was declared an enemy. When Khamenei died in 1989, another leader emerged to take over the system, Ali Khamenei. Over the following decades, Khamenei consolidated authority and managed a persistent confrontation with the outside world that rarely turned into open warfare, but was never fully resolved either. At first, Ali Khamenei didn't command the same level of authority as the revolutionary leader who came before him. But gradually, he strengthened his grip by intertwining the political institutions of the Islamic Republic with the growing power of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. What developed was a system not only designed to govern Iran domestically, but also to extend its influence beyond its borders. Through the Revolutionary Guard and its Foreign Operations Branch, the Quds Force, Iran built alliances with armed groups across the Middle East. Militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and networks stretching into Syria and Yemen became pieces of a broader regional strategy. Rather than confronting its rivals head-on, Iran mastered the art of indirectly shaping conflicts across the region, expanding its reach while maintaining plausible deniability. Israel observed these developments with a watchful eye. Iranian-backed forces were steadily enhancing their military capabilities near its borders, particularly in Lebanon and Syria. For Israeli security planners, the prospect of facing coordinated pressure from multiple fronts represented a serious long-term strategic threat. Yet, a full-scale war between Israel and Iran remained unlikely. Neither side wanted to unleash a regional conflagration. Instead, their confrontation settled into a quieter, more ambiguous pattern. Intelligence services began targeting each other's networks. Shipments of weapons were intercepted. Covert operations disrupted critical infrastructure. Iranian scientists and military figures tied to sensitive programs were mysteriously assassinated. Cyber attacks targeted nuclear facilities and energy systems. None of these actions were officially declared acts of war. Governments rarely acknowledged them publicly, but the intentions behind these operations were crystal clear. The rivalry had moved into the shadows, evolving into a clandestine conflict where both sides tested boundaries while avoiding all-out war. The conflict between Iran and its rivals unfolded in the shadows, characterized by espionage, sabotage, and carefully calibrated strikes designed to avoid overt escalation. This invisible war dragged on for years without a single decisive event tipping the balance. Yet gradually, the nature of the battle shifted. No longer was the struggle confined to influence or proxy conflicts. It converged around a critical question that would redefine the entire confrontation. Could Iran one day obtain the ultimate weapon, the nuclear bomb? Everything changed in 2002 when international inspectors uncovered a startling secret. Iran was enriching uranium at two previously undisclosed sites. While uranium enrichment has peaceful civilian applications, primarily nuclear energy, higher enrichment levels provide the essential material for building nuclear weapons. Tehran insisted its nuclear activities were purely peaceful, asserting the country's sovereign right to develop scientific capabilities and nuclear power. However, in Washington and Tel Aviv, this discovery fueled deepening fears. The crux of the concern was no longer if Iran had nuclear technology, it was how advanced and close to weaponization that technology might become. What followed was a prolonged, shadowy campaign aimed at slowing Iran's nuclear progress without sparking open warfare. Cyber attacks struck centrifuges deep inside Iranian facilities. The most notorious example was the Stuxnet virus, a cyber weapon that silently sabotaged Iran's equipment from within. Alongside these technical assaults, Iranian nuclear scientists were targeted in assassinations on the streets of Tehran. Officially, these attacks were denied, yet few questioned the forces behind them. A glimmer of hope emerged in 2015 when, after protracted negotiations, Iran and a coalition of world powers reached a nuclear agreement. This deal sought to restrict Iran's uranium enrichment levels and mandated international inspections of its nuclear facilities. In exchange, crippling economic sanctions would be lifted gradually. For a brief moment it felt as if the relentless ticking of the nuclear clock might finally be paused. But the pause was short-lived. In 2018, President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement, declaring that it failed to permanently block Iran's path to nuclear weapons. Sanctions were reimposed with vigor. Tehran reacted by progressively stepping back from its commitments under the deal, increasing enrichment activity and raising alarm among international inspectors. By the early 2020s, fresh rounds of negotiations began, but trust had frayed on all sides. Each diplomatic effort produced diminishing returns. Intelligence reports shifted tone, no longer viewing Iran's nuclear ambitions as a distant threat, but as an issue pressing closer to a critical threshold. The nuclear program increasingly resembled a clock inexorably ticking forward. And when a clock grows loud enough, the temptation to silence it by force becomes ever harder to resist. While the nuclear dispute dominated international headlines, the deeper, silent conflict had already set the stage for a confrontation with stakes as high as the weapon known around the world as the most powerful ever devised. While diplomatic efforts continued beyond Iran's borders, a serious crisis was emerging inside the country itself. Years of international sanctions had gradually eroded Iran's economy, cutting off access to global markets and stifling foreign investment. By the mid-2020s, these pressures escalated beyond mere economic slowdown. The Iranian currency plummeted in value, steadily losing purchasing power on a month-to-month basis. Inflation surged sharply, affecting basic necessities such as food, fuel, and medicine. For everyday Iranian families, living became a calculated challenge, weighing what essentials could still be afforded. Long lines formed outside grocery stores and pharmacies, quiet yet stark reminders of the heavy domestic toll exacted by Iran's confrontations with the outside world. That mounting frustration soon erupted onto the streets. By late 2025, protests spread across major urban centers and provincial towns alike. Some demonstrators demanded sweeping economic reforms. Others voiced deeper political grievances aimed at the core structure of the Islamic Republic. Videos circulated online depicting crowds chanting defiantly against authorities, an exceptionally bold and risky move in a regime that tolerated very little public dissent. The government responded swiftly and decisively. Security forces broke up demonstrations using arrests and force. The internet was widely restricted across the nation, isolating protesters and impeding the flow of information. In the days that followed, only fragmented footage surfaced, revealing clashes between demonstrators and security forces. Despite the unrest, the regime withstood the strain. Its institutions remained firmly intact, and leadership projected a confident outward front. However, from the eyes of outside observers, Iran appeared to be entering one of its most fragile phases in recent memory. Economically strained, politically pressured, and increasingly isolated on the global stage. For intelligence analysts in Washington and Jerusalem, such fragile moments are critical. Internal upheaval often exposes patterns and vulnerabilities that stay hidden during periods of calm. And over the coming months, these unveiled patterns would lead to a remarkable discovery that would alter the course of events profoundly. By early 2026, diplomatic talks lagged without having completely collapsed. One final round of negotiations convened in Geneva, where American and Iranian representatives gathered to attempt stabilizing the worsening situation. Yet the meeting ended much like many before it. Polite exchanges, persistent disagreements, and no tangible progress. While diplomats talked, intelligence agencies were focused elsewhere. Over preceding months, American and Israeli analysts meticulously tracked the routines of Iran's senior leadership. The patterns of movement between secure facilities, communication habits during bouts of political strife, and the logistics surrounding high-level meetings were carefully scrutinized. Tracking such figures was never straightforward. The supreme leader and the top command of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operated behind layers of security and secrecy, making their activities challenging to monitor. Yet, through patient, systematic observation, critical insights began to emerge that would soon reshape international understanding of Iran's internal dynamics. Behind layers of security meticulously designed to thwart any form of monitoring, some patterns inevitably emerge over time. Even the most tightly guarded systems leave traces. Convoys tend to travel familiar routes more frequently than others. Key meetings often take place in known, repeated locations. Messages flow through specific channels that, while encrypted, ultimately leave discernible clues. Piece by piece, the emerging intelligence began to form a clearer picture. Reports indicated that a gathering of some of Iran's most influential officials was scheduled at a government compound in Thran. This site was deeply linked to the presidency and the national security framework, underscoring its importance. What stood out was not only the location but the remarkable concentration of authority expected in one place. It was exceedingly rare for so many top decision-makers to assemble simultaneously. This presented planners with a daunting dilemma. Such an exceptional chance might not present itself again for many years. Launching a strike could eliminate a significant portion of the country's leadership all at once. A strategic blow of immense magnitude, but also carried the grave risk of igniting a regional war. The decision was far from instantaneous. Analysts painstakingly reviewed the intelligence multiple times, rigorously confirming sources and cross-checking timelines. Nevertheless, as the date of the meeting drew nearer, the window for decisive action narrowed steadily. The strategic question gradually shifted from whether the strike was feasible to whether it should be undertaken at all. Preparation for the operation had been underway well before this opportunity finally materialized. Within Israeli planning circles, it was known as Operation Roaring Lion. Meanwhile, American officials involved in a supporting capacity referred to their role under the codename Epic Fury. The mission's intent was striking in its directness and unprecedented scope, to eliminate the core leadership of the Islamic Republic in one synchronized high-impact strike. Intelligence assessments suggested that several of Iran's most powerful figures, including the supreme leader, senior commanders of the Revolutionary Guard, and key officials charged with national defense planning, would all be present at the Tehran compound that morning. If this information was accurate, the strike would transcend mere infrastructure damage. It would effectively decapitate Iran's strategic command and control. Just before dawn, Israeli fighter jets took to the skies, armed with long-range precision-guided munitions capable of penetrating deep into Iranian territory. Success depended on impeccable timing and flawless coordination. The missiles were programmed to strike multiple buildings within the compound almost simultaneously, arriving within mere seconds of one another. This tactic aimed to prevent any advance warning traveling between targets. According to reports released afterward, the missiles hit their designated objectives almost exactly as planned. Several buildings within the compound were impacted at once, leaving those inside scant chance to escape. Within moments, communications from several senior officials ceased entirely. Early intelligence assessments estimated that approximately 30 high-ranking figures died during the initial strike. Among the casualties were top military commanders and vital members of the national security leadership, marking a devastating blow to Iran's command structure. The most critical revelation came from sources confirming that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who had guided the Islamic Republic since 1989, was inside the compound when the attack struck. For the architects behind the mission, this outcome was nothing short of monumental. Decades of accumulated power and control were gathered in that very meeting, and within a matter of moments, much of it vanished. The strike against Iran's leadership was never intended to be a singular event. Almost immediately after the missiles slammed into the compound in Tehran, a broader military campaign began to take shape across the nation. Israeli aircraft swiftly moved to neutralize Iranian air defense systems, targeting radar installations and missile batteries capable of threatening the follow-up operations. Over the ensuing hours, waves of air strikes hammered military infrastructure connected to Iran's missile program. Among the reported targets were storage facilities, launch platforms, and command centers, as documented by regional monitoring groups. The overarching goal was to cripple Iran's capability to coordinate a swift response and diminish the threat of large-scale missile retaliation. About 30 minutes after the initial strike, the United States formally joined the operation. American naval forces positioned in the region launched cruise missiles targeting military installations in eastern Iran, areas beyond the reach of Israeli aircraft alone. Ground-based rocket systems stationed at US bases also took part in the strikes, thereby broadening the campaign's scope. Public acknowledgement came swiftly. President Donald Trump released a video statement underscoring that the operation aimed to eliminate imminent threats posed by the Iranian regime. Echoing this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the attacks as a defensive imperative intended to prevent any future escalation. For several intense hours, the coalition maintained the initiative. Iranian command networks grappled with the challenge of restoring communications after the decapitation of senior leadership and the significant damage inflicted on military infrastructure. However, the eerie silence that followed the strikes did not signal capitulation. Instead, across the country, surviving elements of the Iranian military began mobilizing anew. Missile batteries were repositioned strategically, and drone launch teams readied their equipment. Though the initial blow had delivered devastating damage, the conflict was far from concluded. Iran was preparing to strike back. And strike back it did. Within hours of the leadership attack, Iranian commanders announced the launch of Operation True Promise 4, a retaliatory campaign aimed at Israeli territory as well as American military positions throughout the region. Missile units that survived the earlier air strikes began firing volleys simultaneously toward multiple targets. The retaliation was not limited to Israel alone. Iranian drones and missiles were unleashed on American bases and Allied facilities across the Middle East. In Bahrain, close to the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, explosions were reported, illustrating the expanding reach and intensity of this escalating conflict. As air defenses sprang into action, the skies over Qatar and Saudi Arabia lit up with interception systems firing relentlessly through the night. Missile fragments rained down on desert highways and industrial areas, signaling the intensifying conflict. The situation escalated further when Iran's regional allies voiced their support. In Yemen, the Houthi movement declared it would resume attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. This announcement sent ripples through global trade. Cargo ships altered their routes, and insurance premiums soared almost immediately, revealing widespread fears that critical maritime trade corridors might once again become battlegrounds. Civilian infrastructure also bore the brunt of this rapidly expanding conflict. In Dubai, a drone strike damaged part of an airport terminal complex, forcing the international airport to halt operations temporarily. Meanwhile, several Gulf states shut portions of their airspace as defense systems diligently tracked numerous projectiles coursing across the region. What had started as a carefully targeted strike against Iran's leadership was now spiraling into a multi-front confrontation, engulfing the Middle East. Governments hurried to fortify their borders and bolster military installations, bracing for further hostilities. When the first full day of fighting concluded, it was evident that the retaliatory wave unleashed by the original strike would extend far beyond Thran, reshaping the regional landscape. As the initial repercussions reverberated across the Middle East, the controversy over the strike quickly moved beyond the battlefield. In Washington, President Donald Trump stood firmly behind the operation, describing it as an essential act of self-defense. He argued that Iran's leadership posed an immediate, undeniable threat to American forces and allies stationed in the area. The administration maintained that removing this leadership was a strategic move, aimed at averting a broader, more perilous conflict. However, critics were not convinced that the threat was truly imminent. Intelligence reports released in previous years indicated that Iran was still some distance from developing a fully functional nuclear weapon. Although its missile arsenal posed a danger to neighboring countries, these weapons did not currently threaten the United States directly. Opponents viewed the strike less as a defensive act triggered by urgent necessity and more as a calculated preventive war, a preemptive move to counter a threat that, in their view, was not yet realized.